With the amount of information available online, it's never been easier to set up your first saltwater aquarium. But with the sheer volume of information out there, it's sometimes hard to decipher what you should and shouldn't listen to as a new hobbyist. So today I'm going to run you through 10 things experienced reefers do that you should avoid as a beginner. And if you want more videos like this every week, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out when I upload. First up is feeding corals. Most coral care guides you see, particularly with LPS corals, will at some point talk about what you should feed your corals. And if you watch any video from a professional coral farm, they will rave about the benefits of directly feeding corals. But as a beginner, feeding corals can do more harm than good and adds an unnecessary layer of complexity and expense. Corals get 85% of their nutrition from your aquarium lighting, and that is plenty to keep almost every available coral healthy and growing well. Adding extra food, whether you're target feeding or broadcast feeding, is likely to increase your nitrate and phosphate levels, which can lead to outbreaks of pests like undesirable algae. So let your tank settle and mature before you even think about adding coral food. And even then, ask yourself if the cons outweigh the smidgen of extra growth you'll achieve. Related to that is heavily feeding your fish. Now, feeding your fish well will likely make them more resistant to disease, show better colours, and in the case of potential coral nippers like angelfish, may even reduce the chances of them nibbling on your polyps, which is a lot less rude than it sounds. And some of the most spectacular tanks you'll see add entire blister packs of food every day. And heavy in, heavy out is a motto that many of us SPS keepers live by. But it's easy to overfeed your first tank, which will again likely lead to outbreaks of nasty algae. And actually, most fish, particularly beginner fish like clownfish, don't require a massive amount of food to stay healthy. And even if you think your filtration is strong, it's best not to risk heavy feeding just because your favourite YouTuber or Instagrammer says it's what they do. My tank takes 6 cubes of frozen food per day, but it's almost 3 years old now and has an absolute ton of filtration and corals to soak up all those excess nutrients. And even then, my phosphate levels are much higher than I'd like. So if you only have a handful of corals, just feed once a day, as little as you can, and only build up slowly if your fish start to look thin. Next up is going bare bottom. No giggling at the back please. There's been a big trend towards running reef tanks without sand beds in recent years, and if I were setting up a new tank today, I'd do so myself. It allows you to increase your flow to the benefit of SPS corals and prevents detritus building up and rotting in your sand bed. But the surface area of sand is a hive of biological activity and allows beneficial bacteria to freely proliferate, which will make your tank much more stable and less prone to outbreaks of nasty pests like dinoflagellates. And that's especially important if you're using man-made rock like real reef rock, which has an inferior filtration capacity than true live rock from the ocean. And as if that's not enough, sand provides a habitat for fish like wrasses and certain gobies, and frankly it looks much cooler than a bare bottom. Next up is chasing elevated pH. Now, pH is actually a very important parameter in a reef tank, but as a beginner, it's probably not something you even need to think about testing. The pH in most aquariums probably sits between around 7.8 and 8.2, which is a perfectly acceptable range. Now, elevating your pH above that will increase the growth rate in your corals, as higher pH levels makes it easier for your stony corals to take up beneficial elements in the water. But chasing pH can be a never-ending battle, often leading to unnecessary and expensive tinkering. Your corals will be just fine at the natural pH your tank settles at, and it's far better to focus on maintaining the single most important parameter for a reef tank, alkalinity. Because of the relationship between pH and alkalinity, if your alk is fine, that will mean your pH is fine too, and will take care of itself. Number 6 is keeping SPS corals. Saltwater aquariums have what is, in my opinion, an unjustified reputation for being extremely difficult to care for. Whereas the reality is that anybody with a bit of diligence, care and time can look after a simple reef tank with fish and beginner-friendly corals. However, while you shouldn't be intimidated at the thought of graduating onto SPS corals at some point, they are one of the main things that gives this hobby a reputation for being difficult. They can be extremely unforgiving of even small swings in parameters or imperfect water quality, and they can crash your water chemistry by draining all of your chemical elements in no time at all. They're not a coral that can look after themselves, and they will require you to test your parameters more often, add various supplements, and in general keep a very close eye on your water quality. Now I think most people recognise this, but I do from time to time hear shops encouraging newbies to try their hand at SPS, and frankly I don't care what anyone else tells you, SPS corals are very difficult to keep and can suck all the fun out of the hobby when all goes belly up. Next up on my list of things experienced reefers do that newbies shouldn't is running lights at high intensities. Reef tank lighting makes an instant difference to how awesome your tank looks, and turning the intensity up to 100% will give you a quite stunning effect, making even an empty tank look freaking awesome. And when you ultimately graduate onto keeping SPS corals, you will no doubt see that some corals respond very well indeed to extremely strong light. And it can be tempting to try to blast your S corals with high light to bring out those elusive rainbow colours. But there are many factors that influence whether or not corals can cope with strong light, and most corals will just bleach out and die if the intensity is too much for them. So if you have SPS corals that aren't looking healthy, it's more likely than not that something other than insufficient light is what's causing their problems. And you can have a spectacular tank with lower light levels, as almost all corals will be very happy indeed in more moderate lighting. Next up is adding trace elements. In any self-respecting local fish shop, you will see row after row of bottles on the shelves. In among them will be bottles of trace elements that promise to improve your coral's colours. Sounds good, right? Well, it's not. Trace elements are an important ingredient in achieving the perfect reef tank, but they are, in my opinion, one of the last things you need to think about on your reefing journey. It's completely unnecessary for any beginner to add trace elements to a tank under a few years old, and even then the basics of this hobby will always have the most significant impact on the health of your aquarium. Good filtration, a mature system, stable levels of alkalinity, calcium, nitrate and phosphate, and appropriate lighting and flow is all you need as a beginner. Hell, it's all 95% of us in the hobby will ever need to achieve our goals. And I'd bet good money that anybody watching this video would be delighted with the way their corals look if their basic water parameters were on point, and that the addition of trace elements would have little to no noticeable impact on how good your corals look. So save yourself a bit of cash and invest the time instead in keeping on top of your nutrients, which will have a much greater impact on how good your corals look. First on the podium is keeping finicky fish. For me, fish are as big a part of the hobby as corals, and I absolutely love the challenge of providing a stable environment for notoriously difficult fish like the copper-banded butterfly. And as is always the way, some of the most spectacular fish in the hobby are also some of the most difficult to keep. Ah, forbidden fruit. But finicky fish are no joke, and the stories you read about expert-only fish are all true. Many difficult fish require mature, established aquariums with an abundance of natural microfauna to eat, and sadly without that they will wither and die. And there are few things sadder to watch than a beautiful animal suffering and slowly dying in your care. And of course it's a surefire way of pouring cash money down the drain. But the good news is there's no shortage of spectacular, easy to keep fish in the hobby. So leave tricky fish to those with years old tanks and dedicated experienced heads, and keep it as something to look forward to when you've built up your own experience. Number 2 is making the hobby complicated. There are endless options in terms of filters, gadgets, lighting and potions that you can add to your tank. And if you look at the sump of an SPS dominated tank, you will probably see endless filters, pipes, pumps, lights and tubes. And while all of that stuff does serve a purpose, it's totally unnecessary as a beginner. All you need is something like a skimmer to take care of your filtration, then lights and flow to keep your corals healthy. 90% of this hobby is about getting the basics right, and anything beyond that is an unnecessary distraction and expense, especially when you're new to the hobby. The less equipment you have in your tank, the more you'll be able to focus on what really matters, your water quality. In your first year, your time and money is best spent testing your water parameters and researching on how to keep them stable. Your tank will likely find itself a natural balance, so see where it settles and try to interfere as little as possible. Reef tanks hate change, so before you add any additional equipment, ask yourself what you're trying to achieve in doing so, why you're trying to do that, and whether it will really make your aquarium better. And the number one thing that pro reefers do that noobs shouldn't is ditching water changes. Running a reef tank without water changes seems to be the holy grail for most hobbyists. And there are systems like Triton method that enable you to do just that. This is the reef tank Triton themselves run, and I think it's fair to say we'd all be reasonably happy if our tanks looked like this. But Triton is a complicated regime that should very much be the preserve of intermediate and experienced reefers only. And while it does allow you to drop water changes, it instead gives you various other tasks to complete, like supplementing trace elements and sending off water samples regularly for laboratory testing. And when those results come back with bad things in your water, guess what they recommend you to do to fix it? Yep, water changes. If you don't follow the additional steps required by the likes of Triton, it will likely end in tears. A regular water change regime with good quality source water is just so important for a new hobbyist, and it's the one thing that you're best sticking with for as long as possible. Now, if you do drop water changes, you won't necessarily notice an immediate impact, and it might take months before you notice the change. But your tank will slowly build up harmful levels of certain things like nitrate and phosphate, and will slowly deplete beneficial things like calcium and alkalinity. So don't get sucked in by experienced hobbyists who've had success without water changes. It's their skill and knowledge that brings that success, not the lack of water changes.